Hey, everybody, welcome back. It's another episode of the Club Eisenhower podcast. I'm your host, Todd Arrington, the director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum in beautiful Abilene, Kansas. And this month we're talking to Randy Sowell, who is an archivist at the Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri, right outside of Kansas City. And we're going to be talking about records related to the Korean War. Let's see, the Korean War started in 1950, so this is a significant year, I guess, in that it's the, well, let me do the math here, Randy. Help me with the math. Is it 75 years?
Yeah, 75th year, anniversary. Yeah.
Uh-huh. That's why I became a historian, because I don't.
June
and then
25th,
when I got to graduate school and realized I was going to have to take statistics, I was not very happy. Anyway, Randy, thanks so much for being on with us, and
you're welcome.
To Eisenhower.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, great to have you here. So again, talking about the Korean War, which started in 1950. It was, of course, Harry Truman was president at that point. And Randy, you guys obviously are the repository for all things Harry Truman. So I'm guessing when we're talking about the Korean War, we're talking for you guys about a lot of records that are part of, have to do with President Truman and his leadership during the Korean War. Is that right?
That's correct. We have the personal papers of Harry S. Truman, including his presidential files. We have a collection here at the library called the President's Secretary's Files, which I believe are equivalent to the Ann Whitman files at the Eisenhower Library. These are the president's personal papers, and there's a lot of material in there about the Korean War and decision-making on the highest level of the United States government during that period. So we also have a large collection in Truman's papers called the Korean War File, or Selected Records relating to the Korean War. These are State and Defense Department documents originally classified that were copied, old style copied, and kept in President Truman's papers as a reference for the staff and for him to look back and see things that had been decided or memos that he needed to see. And that's a very large segment of material as well. Plus, there are hundreds of boxes of mail in the official file of the Truman papers having to do with the Korean War, the largest segment of them being public mail or reacting to the dismissal of General Douglas MacArthur in spring of 1951. But there's also mail about the recovery of remains of soldiers, prisoners of war, prayers for peace and for the soldiers in Korea, offers to assist, public comments on the war, all kinds of things. So it's a very good record of materials, a very voluminous record of materials documenting the public opinion as expressed by those people on the Korean War. So those are all Truman's papers. We also have the personal papers of people like Dean Acheson, Secretary of State, who was greatly involved in decision-making relating to the Korean War. Clark Clifford had left office by that time, but he was often consulted. He was now, by that time, a private attorney in Washington, but sometimes Truman would consult him about things. His aide, George Elsey, we also have his papers. He was an important member of the White House staff with assignments relating to the Korean War. He kept a lot of the documents in his papers relating to decision-making in Korea. Plus a lot of other paper collections that some of which are from less famous and less well-known people that I'll be talking about those at the more specifically maybe at the luncheon learn tomorrow. But we also have a body of federal records relating to the Korean War, some military unit diaries and other materials. We have a lot of those for World War II, but I think we have some relevant materials concerning Korea as well. So pretty large quantity of material.
Yeah, I'll say. Sounds like you guys have a ton. I should have asked you this at the beginning. How long have you been at the Truman Library? And sort of a second part to that question, Randy, is the Korean War a special area of interest for you personally, or this is just something that you sort of picked up along the way in your work at the library?
Well, it's mostly something that I've acquired knowledge about during the course of my studies as a graduate student, as and as a archivist here at the library, where we often deal with materials relating to the war, in answering reference questions and in processing or reprocessing manuscript collections that we have, some of which I've mentioned. Um, One thing I have in common with President Eisenhower, he came from the heart of America. He said, very heart of America. Well, to that, there's the only thing I have in common with President Eisenhower, but I also come from this part of the country. I was born in Kansas.
Okay.
And grew up principally in Wichita. I went to Wichita State University as a graduate student and the University of Kansas. In 1993, when a job opening occurred here in the Truman Library, I was brought to the staff here, and I've worked there now 33 years. I'm not the longest serving staff member, but I'm almost the longest serving staff member at the library. So that's my background. It's more of somebody who has learned a lot about the Korean War, not a person who is by any means an expert on it. But I've acquired a lot of information about it over the years.
Yeah, it's amazing how much you can learn just spending all that time with the documents
Oh yes,
and answering people's questions too. I know in
yes,
other places where I've worked, I always found that it was really valuable to work with the public, because you would get so many questions, and that's how you would learn a bunch
yes,
of this stuff.
inevitably.
Yeah, so that was something I always really enjoyed, was getting to talk to people and get those really good questions, because I always found myself learning a lot from that. And
Yeah.
also, when you get to a place and you're new, spend as much time as possible around people like you who've been there for a while, and can also help somebody learn. I know when I came here, there are a number of people here who've been here quite a while, and so it's been really nice to have people here with that institutional knowledge that can kind of help guide you along when you're new.
Yes.
Yeah, and you said something about some of the other papers you have, like the Dean Acheson papers, and we do have something similar here with the Ann Whitman papers, as you mentioned. He was President Eisenhower's secretary the whole 8 years of his presidency, and those are very heavily used research materials here.
Yes.
Do you find that's the case there as well, with that the secretary files are really valuable to people?
Yeah, the ones that I mentioned, the President Secretary's files of the Truman Papers, or PSF, and the Korean War file of State and Defense Department documents are very heavily used. We have actually focused on digitizing and making available in the National Archives catalog many of these records. Fairly recently now, we've digitized the CIA reports that are in the President Secretary's files, also the foreign affairs series in that collection, the PSF, which contains a lot of information about the Korean War. Also, we are now digitizing the selected records relating to the Korean War, the State Defense Department documents that I mentioned. We've had researchers come all the way from Korea to look at those materials, so we've been very interested in making those available as much as we can online. It's an ongoing process, so we are responding to the obvious interest of people in those collections, but so far we've only been able to digitize a fairly small percentage of President Truman's papers, even relating to the Korean War. The public mail that I mentioned, no, that's you have to come here to see that. A lot of the personal papers haven't been fully digitized, although we have been able to digitize Secretary Acheson's memos of conversation, which are available online throughout his years as Secretary of State, 49 to 53. So selectively, other collections, mostly we've had to focus on President Truman's papers, and especially those that were most sensitive and are probably the greatest historical interest.
Yeah, we're trying to digitize too, and it's just such a monumental task. I mean, in our case, we have 30 million documents here.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure it's something similar at Truman
about
as well. So
maybe about half of
the
that.
public loves digitization.
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
we're closer to about
Yeah, the
16,
public
17
loves
meg pages.
digitization.
Hmm. They do.
Oh, okay. Um, yeah, I mean, everybody wants easy access, understandably, but it's just such a long process. And I think I'm not an archivist; I'm a historian, but I know it's not just pull out papers and run them through a scanner. You got to prepare them and do all this stuff. It's quite a process. So it is slow going. I know when you're digitizing.
That's true. Yes, and we're
Um,
devoting a lot of resources to that.
yeah. So specifically to the Korean War, do you have any kind of Korean War records? Do you have any kind of favorites that things maybe you've just come across over the years that really sort of stood out to you? I definitely want to talk about what you guys have specific to the Truman MacArthur thing. Actually wrote a paper on that one time, but but of course Eisenhower worked for MacArthur at one point before World
Yes,
War
he
II in the
did.
Philippines.
Yes.
So anyway, yeah. So but do you have any kind of favorites of things that you just have sort of found along the way that you really
Well, I was
sort of caught
thinking
your
about
attention?
that. Yeah, I was thinking about that. There are a couple of things I find very interesting among the president's papers. One thing I liked, and I'm looking here at, is a transcript of a diary entry of President Truman. I've always liked, dated June 30th, 1950, which was 5 days after the war began. Truman was back home in Independence when the invasion occurred, and he immediately flew back to Washington. On the morning of June 30th, these events occurred, and he recorded them in his legible scrawl in his just a piece of note paper, what we call his diary. Quoting here from the diary, Frank Pace, who was Truman's Secretary of the Army, called at 5 a.m. EDT, Eastern Daylight Time. I was already up and shaved, which was
Gee.
not unusual for Harry Truman. He was an early riser. Pace said MacArthur wanted 2 divisions of ground troops, authorized a regiment to be used in addition to the authorizations of yesterday to be used at max discretion. In other words, this is a limited use of troops with consideration of sending more. This is literally while the North Koreans were chasing and forging southward, driving the South Koreans back. I don't know if they had taken Sowell by that time, but they did very early on. And the South Korean forces were in a very bad situation at this point. To continue, Truman's diary entry was briefed by Colonel Akoff at 7 o'clock, called Pace and Louis Johnson, who was Truman's Secretary of Defense, and told him to consider giving MacArthur the 2 divisions he asked for, and also to consider the advisability of accepting the 2 divisions offered by the Chinese nationalist government. That government is still recognized as the 5th permanent member of the Security Council, UN. Since Britain, Australia, Canada, and the Netherlands have come in with ships and planes, we probably should use the Chinese ground forces. End of quote. I find that interesting because partly it shows Truman already thinking of this as a United Nations endeavor. She
Right.
was very much committed to the United Nations, and he saw this as a test of the UN's ability to enact its mandate to preserve peace and to check aggression. But also this issue of using the Chinese nationalists, this became rather controversial later. It's Truman's initial inclination was to say yes if they want to come in, but he was worried about it even then, as you'll see in a moment. And eventually he came to the conclusion that it wouldn't be worth the effort to get Chiang Kai-shek's forces into Korea. They were probably better needed in Formosa at that point, or Taiwan. But Truman continued the diary entry. What will that do to Mao Zedong? We don't know. He's already thinking about how the Chinese or communist Chinese government would react to Chiang Kai-shek's forces getting involved in South Korea. Continuing the diary entry, must be careful not to cause a general Asiatic war. Russia is figuring on an attack in the Black Sea and toward the Persian Gulf. Both prizes Moscow has wanted since Ivan the Terrible, who is now their hero with Stalin and Lenin, unquote.
Wow.
This is Truman, the historian, He was already thinking not merely of the communist threat, but of Russian history. And he saw the Korean adventure possibly as an opening foray in a larger planned endeavor, which may not have been the case, probably wasn't, but he didn't know that at the time. A planned conspiracy on the part of the Allies, Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, to move in more directions than one at the same time and challenge the United States and its allies. So he was already thinking about maybe this is a feint. Maybe the Soviet Union is going to get involved in the area of the Black Sea and breaking into the areas of the south there, Turkey, Greece. He was worried about that, and he didn't know at the time that that wouldn't ultimately transpire. But that's kind of very interesting for those reasons, and I think it also shows Truman thinking historically, which he was prone to do. He said, "There's nothing new in the world except the history you do not know. People don't change, and the more history you know, the less you'll be surprised by what happens every day."
That is a great quote. Wow. Yeah, this is all really interesting because, of course, it's only when all this is happening, it's only 5 years after the end of World War II.
That's true.
But of course, the Cold War is happening, and did Truman ever consider? Do you think this is calls for speculation? I realize, but do you think Truman, if the UN had not committed forces from other countries too, do you think Truman would have gone at it alone, just the United States, or was he bound and determined that the only way that the U.S. was going to get involved was through the UN?
Well, I think he would have preferred to work through the United Nations, but he would have argued that the United Nations Charter allowed members of the UN to act independently in defense of the goals of the charter. So I suspect, I don't know this, but I suspect that he, with any allied nations that were willing to take part, would have acted anyway. As it happened, as you know, the Soviet delegate was boycotting the Security Council at that time in protest of the People's Republic of China not being given the seat on the Security Council that was still occupied by nationalist China. And so there were no votes against the resolution calling for aid to South Korea in the Security Council. It wasn't vetoed as the Russians weren't there to veto it. And Truman did get that endorsement of the Security Council for his actions.
Yeah, and again, the UN is a new organization at this point. This is really one of the first big tests of the UN, its ability to organize and manage conflict and to get all of the countries working together. So this was a big test, and of course, Truman had been, to my understanding, very, very adamant about the need for an organization like the UN after World War II, and so it's understandable why he especially really felt strongly about the need for this to be a UN action and not just a United States action. At least is my understanding of that history.
That's true, I believe.
And since we mentioned, I'm kind of jumping around here on you, Randy, but since you mentioned Taiwan a couple of times, we had a delegation here from Taiwan about a month ago, and I know they were going to the Truman Library.
Yeah, yes.
Were you involved in that visit at all?
Oh, yes, we did welcome them here, and they did some research here. They were interested in the history of their government and the kinds of institutions that could preserve that history, and we were very glad to welcome them here as you did.
Yeah.
And I remember that was, as you say, about a month ago. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was really a lot of fun. We had a long conversation, and they did research in our facility as well.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a fun thing. These were folks who, my understanding was, they were from kind of what would be considered maybe the counterpart of the National Archive of the American National Archives in Taiwan.
Yes,
I think that's what I understood. So anyway, yeah, they were a lot of fun to talk to, and very happy to be here. And yeah, that was neat. I'm glad I got to come see you guys as well. So yeah, since you mentioned MacArthur, I guess I'll ask I'll ask about MacArthur. As I said a minute ago, Eisenhower did work for MacArthur in the Philippines before World War II. MacArthur was a bit of a strong personality, we'll say. I think I'm
Yeah, yes.
trying to say that politely. Very, very different from Eisenhower, of course. But there were times later on when MacArthur was complimentary of Eisenhower, and then there were times he was kind of dismissive of Eisenhower. At one point, he said Eisenhower was the best clerk he ever had. So,
Yes. Mm.
so I'd love to know more about what specifically, maybe just some examples of what do you guys have there related to the whole controversy when Truman or MacArthur, I think if I remember correctly, suggested using nuclear weapons against the Chinese, and that's when there probably was more to it than that, but I think that's when Truman fired him, and that was what he fired him over. So what kinds of records do you guys have that deals with sort of the whole Truman MacArthur controversy, showdown, whatever you want to call it?
Well, I mentioned the hundreds of boxes of public mail, pro and con. I suspect mostly con, anti-firing MacArthur that Truman received at the White House after that decision in April 1951, which triggered a firestorm of controversy and discussions of impeachment in Congress. I think we have a lot of interesting documents on that in Truman's papers, a lot of which we've been able to digitize because of the level of public interest in the subject. One of my personal things I find very interesting from the President's Secretary's files, again, PSF, is a copy of the original order from message from President Truman to General MacArthur, stating that in polite terms, it has become necessary for me as President and Commander in Chief of the Armed Forces to relieve you of your commands. And Eisenhower had several different commands in Japan and also the United Nations command. And the particular draft that I've seen and that we have online shows some handwritten additions, including a statement that, well, the reasons why I'm taking this decision will be provided later in a separate message. And then Mr. Truman signed it at the bottom. His signature is on there very authoritatively. And that's in other words, he approved that wording. And it was sent along eventually to MacArthur. So that's an interesting document. Truman had only met MacArthur once at the Wake Island conference, and he did not like MacArthur by reputation. And as Roosevelt had also found, he found MacArthur difficult to deal with. There were a number of clashes.
I don't think Truman was alone in that.
No. A number of conflicts between them over various things, but the reasons for the dismissal are complicated. We know that MacArthur had violated an order not to issue statements about foreign policy until they'd been cleared by the State Department, and he went ahead and wrote a letter, I believe, to Speaker Martin, Speaker of the House, Republican Speaker of the House. I guess he was Speaker at the time. He was a Republican leader anyway in the House of Representatives, criticizing or by implication some aspects of U.S. policy as set by the Truman administration. And there were some other issues at that time, but Truman by that time had enough, I guess, and he spoke to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they agreed that it was time to bring in General Ridgway. So MacArthur was ordered to hand his commands over to General Ridgway. He returned to the United States, where he received a great hero's welcome, a ticker tape parade in New York, and a dramatic speech before both houses of Congress.
Those are also things that Eisenhower received when he came back after victory in Europe.
Yes, he did. Mm-hmm.
Parade, and he addressed the joint session of Congress. So I guess.
Would you like to hear the letter something from a letter that President Truman wrote to his wife first time he met General Eisenhower?
Absolutely.
I was looking at this the other day. June 19th, 1945, the president was in Washington, and Bess Truman was back in Independence, where she stayed during the summer months with her mother. And he mentions General Eisenhower having arrived in Washington to receive the hero's welcome on June 19th. He writes, P.S. Bess, Eisenhower's party was a grand success. I pinned a medal on him in the afternoon. He is a nice fellow and a good man. He's done a whale of a job. They're running him for president, which is okay with me. I'd turn it over to him now if I could. I'm sure he felt that way at the time. He liked Eisenhower. Their relationship became more complicated, to put it mildly, later. But I don't think Truman ever thought very highly of MacArthur. But he was willing to work with him. It was really just became impossible, I think, in his opinion, for that relationship to continue. But Eisenhower, he liked and trusted. He was his Army Chief of Staff, and then I believe Supreme Commander of NATO
Right.
also. And yeah, so their relationship up to 51 was very amicable, in fact, friendly, as far as I can tell. It's interesting that he wrote that to Mrs. Truman in a personal letter. And Truman and Eisenhower had a lot in common,
Absolutely, yeah.
as you know. But well, anyway, I thought you might be interested to see that, hear that, because of the you mentioned Eisenhower's return in 1945 from Europe, and the reception that he received, which Truman participated in.
Yeah, we talk all the time here about the idea that people wanted Eisenhower to run for president, and at one point supposedly Truman basically offered to step aside and let Ike run as a Democrat.
That is true. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course Eisenhower didn't do that, even though he never had said publicly what party he belonged to or anything like that. Yeah, and it is a shame that their relationship soured. And there's some irony there too, in that, of course, Truman did not like the fact that when Eisenhower did run in '52, it was as a Republican, and of course, Ike's campaign was primarily about the ways that we haven't been well served.
Yes,
with by the Truman administration, and Truman took that personally, as anyone would, I think. But the irony there is that 8 years later, Eisenhower felt the exact same way about Kennedy running his campaign on, we've become too complacent and we haven't been well served by the Eisenhower administration. So, I think there was a little, Ike should have maybe remembered how that felt.
Yes, well.
Yeah, he was very unhappy with Kennedy.
Oh, is that right? Mm-hmm.
Kennedy ran his, and of course, Richard Nixon, who had been Ike's vice president for 8 years, was the Republican nominee, and so Nixon is running as continuing the sort of continuing the same type of administration.
Right.
Kennedy is running as the change agent.
And I think in both cases, maybe you had the president leaving office feeling that this election was kind of a referendum.
Yes.
On what he had done for 8 years. And Eisenhower may have had some reservations about Nixon. I know that Truman had some reservations about Adlai Stevenson, the nominee of the Democratic Party in '52, but it was only natural, I guess, for them to feel defensive as preparing to leave office, about their legacy, about how they would be viewed. And so, I guess it happened in both cases.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. And again, my understanding also is that their relationship did stay frosty for a while, and then when they were together at the Kennedy funeral, is when they kind of started to thaw out a little bit, and they started to kind of talk to one another again. So anyway,
that's true.
Yeah. So, what about? Was there any talk about a negotiated peace in the Korean War, and did Eisenhower and Truman discuss any of this? Truman, as you noted, Truman actually pulled Eisenhower out of retirement to go and become the first Supreme Commander of NATO. Was there any conversation? Are there any documents that you guys have that show any kind of conversation between Eisenhower and Truman about what's going on in Korea and the possibility of a peace, anything like that?
Yeah. Offhand, no, I can't recall anything. Eisenhower was involved at Truman's request in organizing the forces in Europe, and he was not an individual unlike MacArthur, who wanted to inject himself into debates with this supreme commander, the commander-in-chief. He was following orders, and that was his focus. I can't remember seeing discussions, record of discussions between them about the situation in Korea specifically. I know that, as you know, in 1951, these torturous negotiations between the communists and the Western UN forces, UN representatives began in Korea, Panmunjom, I guess, and those talks dragged on, and of course they were hampered for a long time by the prisoner of war issue. A lot of Chinese and North Korean prisoners did not want to be repatriated. There were a few Americans also who had been captured who didn't want to be repatriated. But basically, it was an issue that the communist side insisted on having repatriation, and Truman adamantly refused to do that, to send people who didn't want to go back to those countries back against their will. That hung up the negotiations, I think, through much of 51 and 52 while the fighting continued. I think Eisenhower, when he emerged as a candidate, was supportive of negotiated settlements, as far as I know. He did not oppose the negotiations. I can't remember him taking a position on the POW issue during the campaign, but it was, I think that he was not opposed at all, that I know of, as far as I know, to the idea of negotiating and settling the conflict, if possible. After he was elected and after Stalin's death soon thereafter, this may have opened up some possibilities, and there was a compromise then reached on the POW issue, a complicated compromise. So I think they were pretty much on the same page on that issue. They wanted to avoid a wider war.
Right. Which, of course, would have been the exact opposite if MacArthur had
presumably, yeah.
to go after the Chinese.
Yeah.
What about Eisenhower's trip to Korea? You know, he famously said during the campaign, "I shall go to Korea." Is there anything in Truman? Obviously, is still president at that point. Is there any? Do you guys have anything in your archive there about that Eisenhower trip to Korea, or anything about again, any correspondence or anything between President Truman and President-elect Eisenhower regarding that trip to Korea?
Oh, yeah. Well, President Truman was not an active candidate, but he was campaigning for Congress, congressional candidates, Democrats, and campaigning for Stevenson on the whistle-stop tours all through the fall, and Eisenhower was campaigning on his train. Right. So they were running against each other, although Truman wasn't on the ballot. Late in the campaign, I believe, Eisenhower made a dramatic statement. The country was eager to get out of the war in Korea. He appealed to this widespread sentiment by saying that if elected, he would go to Korea. "I will go to Korea," he said. He didn't make any big promises, as I recall. He just said, "I'll go there and look into the situation and inspect it," which I guess is perfectly reasonable. Truman took that very badly. He thought it was kind of a grandstanding move. He didn't think that such a trip would accomplish anything. He thought of it as a campaign stunt. I don't know how decisive it was in the elections. Eisenhower won very easily anyway. But Truman sent Eisenhower a message of congratulations, which is basically gracious for the most part, and suggested, really for the first time, that there be a carefully planned transition from one presidential administration to the other. And that was carried out, setting a precedent that has continued with some interruptions since then. And conferences, in other words, arranged between the officials of the outgoing administration and the incoming administration. That was all set up between the Eisenhower and Truman and their representatives. But at the end of that message, Truman added a statement volunteering to offer the presidential airplane, the Independence, to put it at Eisenhower's disposal for his trip to Korea. And if he left it at that, it would have been fine. But he added the phrase, "if you still decide to go," or words to that effect. "If you still want to go, period." And I can't feel that was anything but a jab at Eisenhower, implying that he was playing political games, and that now that he'd won the election, why bother going? And Eisenhower was, I understand, very offended by that, as you might imagine, and he replied again politely, but said, "Well, any army plane will do. I don't, thank you, Mr. President. I don't need your airplane. Anything will do." So that set a bad tone for the personal relationship between them thereafter. Privately, I think Truman was actually worried about Eisenhower's security and safety in
Right.
going to Korea. It was an active war zone. We know what Truman thought of Nixon, the vice president-elect. He didn't think much of Nixon. He wrote privately in a letter to somebody or in a diary entry, I hope everything goes well when he gets over there and that he'll be safe. So maybe an exaggerated concern, but that may have been part of Truman's motivation. But he didn't explain that very well in his message to Eisenhower. So it came out badly. And that's what we have on the trip, which did take place. And it was, you know more about this than I do. I think a fact-finding trip, basically, for Eisenhower. He wanted to see what was going on there in person. I don't think he'd ever been there before. And so that was what happened. He met with Truman at the White House, and they set up these meetings. And in a lot of ways, it was a very smooth transition, except personally, between the two principals.
We did a White House Historical Association virtual book chat a few months ago about a guy who had written a very good book about the transition between Eisenhower and Kennedy, which was also very smooth and very well organized. And Eisenhower was thought Kennedy was too young and didn't have enough experience, and he was very unhappy, as I said already, about the things Kennedy had said during his campaign. But when they first met, Eisenhower came away more impressed than he thought he would be with Kennedy. So perhaps, so it's a shame that Truman and Eisenhower didn't maybe have quite that same cordiality, I guess.
Yeah, by that time their relationship had gotten complicated. They had known each other for quite a while, but there had been some misunderstandings on both sides about General Marshall and McCarthy's criticisms of Marshall, which Truman felt Eisenhower should have been more vocal in separating himself from MacArthur and supporting him. General Marshall, who had helped further Eisenhower's career, certainly. And I don't know, there are various things, but so that's the background of it.
Yeah, and I know Truman really thought highly of Marshall.
Yes, he admired Marshall more than anybody in public life that he ever met.
And then, if I recall correctly, I think Eisenhower's son was serving in the army.
John Sheldon Dowd Eisenhower. Yeah.
You guys have anything?
Yeah.
And I think Truman sort of pulled John off the front lines so that he could attend the inauguration, and Eisenhower, I think, sort of maybe took a little umbrage with that too.
Yes, we do. Is John Eisenhower, right?
John, John.
He was in Korea. He was in the army. President Truman thought that he should witness his father's inauguration, so he ordered him back. And on Inauguration Day, this issue came up between Truman and Eisenhower. Now, I know Truman's side of it, and Eisenhower's side of it I don't know that well. But obviously there was some kind of conversation in the car going from the White House to the Capitol for the ceremony. Eisenhower and Mrs. Eisenhower had not come into the White House to be greeted by Mrs. Truman, which Truman was very angry about that. He thought that was a violation of custom and an insult to his wife. I don't know if that was the intention, but anyway, they came out and got into the car, and there was some discussion at some point. Truman's recollection, which may not be accurate, was that Eisenhower suddenly said, I wonder who ordered my son John back from Korea. I wonder who's trying to embarrass me. And Truman supposedly said, the President of the United States ordered your son to return from Korea. He felt that it was his right to see his father sworn in as president. If you feel that this is intended as an embarrassment to you, the president takes full responsibility. Well, I kind of doubt that was an exact transcript of what was said, but Eisenhower may have asked, and I didn't know John was going to be here. I didn't know that. And Truman said, yes, I did. And with the background between the two men, the hostility that already existed, I think they misunderstood it. I think didn't Eisenhower write Truman a letter then saying, thank you for inviting John back, and I appreciate you didn't tell me about it ahead of time, but I appreciate your doing that. So I don't know. I don't know what happened exactly, but there was some kind of minor or major uh, kerfluffle in the car going to the Capitol. And Truman remembered it later and recounted it in his book, I think his book, Mr. Citizen. But Eisenhower's perspective on it may have been a little different, but it may have been mostly a misunderstanding, as there wasn't a lot of communication between them personally, and they were both busy with other things, as you might imagine. And President Eisenhower then authorized Truman and Mrs. Truman to use the presidential railroad car, the Ferdinand Magellan, to return from Washington to Independence, which the Ferdinand Magellan didn't belong to Harry Truman. It belonged to the president, but he allowed the outgoing president, to use the car. So I don't know if it was quite as serious as all that, but it reflected the deterioration in their relationship. So that's as much as I know about it from President Truman's papers, his side of the story.
Did you get a chance to see the new PBS Kansas City documentary, The Winning the War, about Truman and Eisenhower?
No, I haven't gotten to see that yet. I'll have to check that out.
It was very good. I was there at your place for that premiere event a few weeks ago.
Yes,
we're going to do something similar here very soon. But there's a great scene in there and you've probably seen all of this before. But it's some footage of Truman speaking after his presidency, talking about various things related to the end of World War II. And he does at one point in there speak about this sort of kerfuffle with the Eisenhowers not coming into the White House on the morning of the inauguration to have breakfast with the Trumans. And it was actually a very funny moment there. And maybe you have seen this, where Truman is sitting there, being Harry Truman. He's got on a suit and he's sitting there and he's talking about the Eisenhower, the tradition, as you noted, that they were they're expected to come into the White House and have breakfast with the outgoing president. And Truman kind of turns in his chair like he's about to get up and looks right at the camera and goes, which he did not do. It struck me very funny when I saw it. It was like, and I think he even smirked a little bit, like he was almost like he was trying to be funny, which he did not do. I that was great. I really liked that.
Yeah.
That was a great moment.
Yeah.
So, anyway, well, Randy, this has been great. I really appreciate your time and your expertise and your decades of service at the Truman Presidential Library. I know that we're coming into the summer now, so we're probably both going to be very busy with visitors and researchers. How do you prefer people get in touch with you guys if they want to? I assume they have to make a research appointment if they want to come there and research the Korean War or anything else that you guys have there. So feel free to tell us how people should get in touch with the Truman Presidential Library if they want to go there and do research.
Oh, well, the easiest way is to contact us by email at truman.reference@nara.gov, or my name is Randy, RANDY, S as in Sam, OWELL, at NARA.gov. That's the best way to make an appointment. We do have appointments right now available through the summer months, but we're expecting more researchers during that period, which is typically the case because a lot of our researchers are from academia, from colleges and universities that usually are on break during the summer months. So I'd encourage people to visit the library or ask us if we have materials really relevant to what they're interested in. Of course, people can come and visit our museum, which is fairly recently remodeled since the pandemic.
It's fantastic.
And
I really enjoyed
they're,
going the other night.
yeah, thank you. And they're welcome to do that without making appointments. And so certainly anybody who would like to see a lot about American history from the 1940s to the 1960s, especially, can visit the Eisenhower Truman libraries, which aren't that museums, not that far apart. And we have a lot of people actually have done that on road trips from Independence to Abilene or vice versa. So people are very welcome to look into what we have on the Korean War and on a lot of other topics as well.
Do you have a sense how I don't know, you probably can't give a percentage or anything, but like is the Korean War a very popular topic with researchers, or are people coming there and looking into other things more regularly, other aspects of Truman's life or presidency?
Well, there's a wide variety of topics that researchers are interested in, but various aspects of the Korean War and rearmament after that it was accompanied by the Korean War, which in many ways is a very significant conflict because it led to the abandonment of a lot of the traditions of the United States. It was after World War II, after all the military had disarmed basically and demobilized. But with the Korean War and with the perceived threat of communism, the Soviet Union especially, the United States entered into a period of mobilization and maintenance of a very strong standing Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, and a national security series of national security institutions like the National Security Council, the CIA, et cetera, that still exist today. And so in that way, the Korean War is as important as World War II in setting the stage for the future. So people are still interested in those topics, especially, but I wouldn't. There are all kinds of things people are interested in relating to that period in history or the life of Harry Truman, which is still an interesting story.
Absolutely, yeah. The museum there was great. I had been there once, gosh, decades ago on a trip, but when I got to see it here a few weeks ago when I was there for that evening event, it was really phenomenal. So you guys did a great job.
Thank you.
Good. All right. Well, Randy Sowell, archivist at the Truman Presidential Library, thank you very much for being on Club Eisenhower today and talking about records from the Korean War. And I hope everybody will do exactly what you said, Randy. They'll come see us and they'll go see you. They can do it all in. I don't know. It'd be a long day. They could do it all in one day, but maybe a couple.
Drive safely. Yes.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Absolutely.
You're welcome.
All right, Randy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.
All right.